Many baseball fans who are of Generation X or before, or maybe even card collectors, will know my next guest. He famously told the baseball world he was number 6 on the back, but number 1 in your hearts. And that was, and that just sort of shows you the sense of humor that he had. I'm speaking, of course, of Julio Cruz, who is now a broadcaster for the Seattle Mariners, where he played second base in the 80s for many years. But in 1997, he was also the Appalachian League Manager of the Year, and I thought a brilliant communicator from the hands-on view that I saw of his team. Led the Pulaski Rangers to the best record in the Appalachian League that year, produced 5 major leaguers from that team, including Mike Lamb. It's a pleasure to have you here, Julio Cruz, joining us from Seattle. And I guess when looking back, the first question I want to ask you, you were the Appalachian League Manager of the Year, but that was the only team you ever managed in professional baseball, to my knowledge, at least affiliated. Why did you get out of the racket?
I'm sorry.
Why did you get out of managing?
Well, my wife got sick, and may she rest in peace. I got out of the game because I had to stay home with my children, and I thought, well, maybe I'll get back in the game in a year or two. Not to be expected, because once you come out of the game, out of mind, out of sight. Is that the way you say it?
That is the way that you say it, and yeah, it's a hard business sometimes. And yes, I do understand that. It's surprising because that team was, and I'm very sorry to hear of your personal troubles, naturally, Julio Cruz. Now, the Mariners broadcaster now, but former Manager of the Year in the Appalachian League. And I got to tell you, I thought one of the reasons why you were successful, I want to see if maybe you remember this, was just the fact that you let the players play. I remember...
Let them play.
And I remember a player, for instance, named Frank Jaramillo, who didn't make the Yes, he didn't make the majors, but you had kind of a shorter roster than most of the other teams in that league did. And I remember you saying to me, I said, well, when do you like to pinch hit? I'd ask you. He said, you know what, I don't like to use pinch hitters. I said, what? He said, yeah, I didn't like it when I was pinch hit for. We're supposed to learn here. Why not? Jaramillo hitting 157 got the winning hit in the game against Johnson City that Saturday in a 4-2 come from behind Pulaski Rangers victory and such. I guess my next question I want to ask you is, do you think that today's managers maybe overmanaged? There's too much specialization.
Too much shifting. Every time you see they're playing the shift, they're over-shifting for this batter, for that batter. They're trying to figure out the game. You're never going to figure out this game. Every game is obviously is different. The ball's going to bounce different every time. And these guys, one thing they don't do is they don't run the bases. They don't steal. They don't bunt. It's all you see on ESPN is the guy who hit the bomb, who hit the long ball. So managing today's guys, especially when they're making all that kind of money, you have to almost let them play, but you try to put a hold on them as far as what they can do and what they can't do.
Well, we're talking to Julio Cruz, who many of you will know being former second baseman for the Seattle Mariners, or maybe one of their broadcasters on their Spanish-speaking network. But I know him best as the manager of the Pulaski Rangers in 1997. Well, I got to say that I do remember watching you play on TV instead for the Mariners. But I wanted to just to ask, you mentioned, and I talked about this at the beginning of the show here, Julio, that I thought that maybe the modern retro ballpark, the less AstroTurf in Major League Baseball, has done away with that speed game. It's now more wait around for the 3-run homer. Yeah, I was going to ask you, it sounds like you agree with me here. What impact do you think the elimination or practical elimination of artificial turf has had on the stolen base in baseball?
Well, you look at today Today, the leading base dealer has 21 stolen bases. Only 21. That's due one to the manager putting a corral on the base runners, to the AstroTurf. When I played on AstroTurf, boy, it was a gem to steal. It was a gem to run on. It was a gem to stand on. It was a gem to just be around a field that's bouncy. You know, the AstroTurf had a little bounce to it. Now you're seeing less and less AstroTurf ballparks.
There's I think it's called Rogers Center now. I still know it as the Sky Dome. I still think
the
has
Sky
it.
Dome.
But I would point out that actually one of the things here that happened yesterday over here in the Appalachian League is the ballpark in Johnson City, Cardinal Park, which also has a new corporate name with a bank that I just can't seem to remember. But it now has an artificial surface infield.
Wow.
And a natural grass outfield, and this is why the game, because we had a lot of rain yesterday, was able to be played in Johnson City yesterday and heard here online on iHeartRadio on 1420 NBC Sports Radio Tri-Cities, whereas the Elizabethton Twins were rained out. So I mean, there's some Julio Cruz benefit to having it in the modern era. I do want to ask you, though, if I can take you back to your managing days. The Appalachian League, it's very unique. I mean, let's face it. The Seattle Mariners know right now, they've got a pretty good idea of what their roster is going to be like in 2018. You don't know, maybe even 2 days before the season starts, who's going to be on your team in the Appalachian League. So tell me, when you're trying to put together, let me ask you this. Did you, as a manager of the Pulaski Rangers, have any say-so in, that guy that we just drafted? I've heard a little about him. I'd like him here in Pulaski. I mean, he's just out of high school. Did you have any say-so in putting together your roster initially? Okay, tell us how the roster comes together.
No, that comes down from the player development. And they send them down to me, and they say, we want him on the 5th slot or the 6th slot, or we want him to lead off. And that's what I do. I just pencil them in as I'm told. That Pulaski, that Pulaski team was stacked with older players. That's why we ran away with that league. Except for the last game against the Bluefield Orioles, where we lost, and we were stacked with nothing but 22-year-olds, so a couple 23-year-olds, and that's a league for 19, 20-year-olds, kids coming out of college, junior college, high school. Yeah, so I was stacked pretty good, and it was with the direction of the player development.
Well, what then? I know that the player development department of these baseball teams have a lot of say-so and such, but at what point do you kind of scratch your chin and say, well, you know what? I think that this Mike Lamb is a guy that can go far. I mean, what kind of input do you give back to the organization as an Appalachian League manager?
Every day after the games, you file a report, and you say, John Doe has a great swing. I believe he will, in 2-3 years, be a major leaguer. That's the say-so you have. You don't have much of a say-so, well, I'm going to bat him 5th. I'm going to bat him 6th. Like you said, I didn't know from day to day who I was going to have to put in a lineup. And I just it was made easy for me because player development sent down the information. So all I did was I told the kids, hey, it's not me who's writing the lineup. It's the people up above me. So just play hard, and whatever happens, happens.
Well, I know also that team, it seemed to me, as I recall, that it was a good team. It had a lot of good camaraderie. I remember your pitching coach, Lee Tunnell, who some people will remember. And I had seen Lee Tunnell. I mean, I was a Pirates fan growing up. I had gone to games that he had pitched. I actually remember bringing an old scorecard that I had that he was still in. And, I mean, all the players coming around and all that. That doesn't happen unless the pitching coach is well liked by his players and they're making comments and such.
Exactly.
Tell me a little bit about how you tried to instill a positive atmosphere with an Appalachian League team.
Well, what I did was I let Lee do anything that had to do with pitching. I let him do it because I wasn't a pitcher. So I said to Lee, you take him in, you put him in. I'll put him in the lineup. You put him in, and and you also take him out. All I'll do is I'll manage the game, and I'll take it from there.
Now, you, as I said, were a manager. I thought you had old school philosophies. I remember you telling me, for instance, and this is unheard of now, that you really didn't like to use pitch counts. You said, they've got to be able to throw 9 in the major leagues. Why not have them throw 9 here? And that is a total different organizational philosophy than what's now going on in the Appalachian League. I'm not necessarily sure it's a good thing, and I've talked a lot about this on my show, but do you think that we could ever get to a day where we have, let's say, bigger pitch counts, or changing kind of how we're developing pitchers right now, where it seems like they're really being babied?
No, I think that that the year of 8 and out, 9 and out, it's all done with Tom Seaver, Steve Carlton, Gaylord Perry. Those guys would go 8, 9 innings. They would pitch 300 innings a year. Now these guys are pitching 5 and gone. They pitch 5 and they're looking over their shoulder to see who's coming out to get them.
I've always felt that was a bad thing because, in the NBA they talk about market the star. How can you market a star pitcher if he's only going to play 5/4 or 5/9 or 2/3 of the ball game?
And they're doing it, Marky. They're doing it. They're giving these guys tons and tons of money. I'm talking in the $100 millions. They're giving those pitchers who go 5, $200-300 million contracts for 10 years, and because they figure they'll last that long. If they don't pitch that long, if they don't pitch 9 innings, they're going to last 10 years.
It's the philosophy of don't drive your Ferrari to work. Now, I guess I'm in the mentality of if I've got a Ferrari, I want to show it off. I definitely want to drive it to work. Hey, we're talking to Julio. Yes.
Amen. Amen.
We are talking to Julio Cruz, who some of you, if you've got maybe the MLB package and speak Spanish, have watched him on a Mariners broadcast. Many of you will remember him from playing with the Seattle Mariners. But some of you may remember him as the manager of the year in 1997 in the Appalachian League. You mentioned how your roster is given to you. Maybe you have some strategy within the game or something. I mean, obviously, if a pitcher is getting shelled, it's your responsibility to take him out. And, I guess you can decide. But ask them, how much in-game strategy is determined by the organization? Did you have, for instance, the green light to tell your players when to steal? Certainly, I'd imagine positioning, bunting, that sort of thing.
Yep, I had the green light to tell my players when to run, when not to run, when to bunt, when not to bunt, hit and run, not hit and run. Yeah, I had all that, the strategic part of the game down, and we led the league in stolen bases naturally because I was a base stealer, so I could tell when the pitcher was going home. And I could relay that to the runner and make it easier for the runner to steal the base. Now, all the strategy was on my shoulders.
Okay, so we're talking to Julio Cruz. I'm trying to find out a little bit about developing the ball club, and you mentioned the reports that you would give to the organization and such. But initially, it's slotted. We want this guy to hit cleanup. We want this guy to hit 9.
Right.
You might want to have this person as the DH, that sort of thing. At what point, though, at what point do you think that an Appalachian League team really takes hold and comes together? I mean, like I said, they're the day before the season begins, basically
Yeah.
coming together. When do you think during the course of the season your team
It,
came
it,
together?
it took me a good month to have those guys gel, and we were like 13 and 19 in those games, and I called a workout. We were in Martinsville, Virginia, and we called. Is it Virginia?
Yes.
Martinsville, yeah, Martinsville. And I called a early practice, and the guys were really mad, and I was mad too because I like to sleep, so I had to get up, and then we just went through a fundamental, and from then on, we went through a fundamental. We stayed at the ballpark all day. We ordered them food. We stayed at the park all day. They got all excited, and we went on a tear. I mean, a tear, winning 19 of the next 21 games, and we just blew everybody by. And I think they got the message that if you don't put out, you're not going to play. And they did not get upset when John Doe didn't play that day. I would give a guy a day off every once in a while because that heat there really bothers a lot of these kids. And not only that, they're playing so many more games than high school. High school is what? 10 games, 12 games, 16 games.
Not much, yeah.
Yeah, and the Appy was 72 games, I think it was.
Yeah, approximately 68, 70 games, depending on the year.
70 games, yeah. So that's a lot, and in that heat, that bears you down. So I would try to figure out who would need a day off, and it worked just right. I mean, I was dumbfounded by the record that we had at the end of the season, 43 and 19, something like that. Again, we lost to the Bluefield Orioles, and it was my fault because we won the playoffs. We won the division by 5 games. So we had 5 days off, and instead of me practicing game situations, I let the kids play home run derby and just have a good time on the field, where Bluefield was still playing all the way to the end to see if they were going to make it into the playoffs. So they were in play mode, ready when they played against us, and they beat us 2 out of 3. And I think it was my fault because I didn't put in game situations during those 5 days.
Well, Julio Cruz, I want to say that that's very interesting, and I'd say a great admission from you and all that, and I think it shows what a good manager does in taking, the heat when it is deserved, if you feel that is the case. I did want to ask you this. I'm looking through your career here, and you did play for a lot of managers who had some very fine reputations. Darryl Johnson, I know he won a pennant. Certainly, Tony La Russa.
Yeah.
I know. I always thought Rene Lockman could have been a much better manager than I guess he ever really had the chance to be. You also played for one of the most maligned managers in modern baseball history, in Maury Wills. I just was curious.
Maury Wills.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you that. What was the person? Jim Fregosi comes to mind. You played for him. What was the manager that you think you learned the most from in playing?
Tony La Russa, by far.
And how so?
He would go each game. Before each game, he would go. Well, we were taking grounders and all. He would go and just whisper little things in your ear as far as, you're going to be the big horse today. You're going to turn this game around. You're going to be the leader, and little things to get you motivated for the game. And it was great because then you did become the main key of that game, and you won the hey, how did he know that? How did he know that I was going to get a double in the ninth inning to win this game? How did he know? And he had a sense, and so I managed that way.
Well, Julio Cruz, I got to tell you something. I sensed that, and I do remember covering that years ago. That was the way that you kind of managed, because I remember the positive. Obviously, when you're winning, it's going to be positive, but there was something a little bit more about that Pulaski team that you had. That was the team that certainly smiled the most in the year that I did play-by-play in the Appalachian League. Now, I had a last-place team, so, I mean, but even so, and what you're saying, really, I think you did project that out there. I know you've got a good gig in broadcasting. Let me ask you this. What's better, broadcasting or managing?
Oh, managing by far. But I don't like to be a manager. I like to be an instructor. And for the past 30 years, I've tried to get on with a team to be an instructor, and there's no one out there. No takers.
Guys,
so the only one that took me was the Mariners, and they offered me the radio job.
Well, I'll tell you what, that is, I think that's a glaring oversight. Because, as I said, I've seen you work. I remember it just 20 years later. I remember you as a player, and I know a lot of my audience will too, Julio Cruz. And I know if they speak Spanish and they've got the MLB package, they're going to be checking out a Mariners Spanish broadcast or hit that SCP button or something like that, you know. But what I want to thank you for joining us here and tell us a little bit about the insights of what it takes to be an Appalachian League manager, because I'll tell you what, there weren't very many who did it better than you. Julio Cruz, Tri-City Sports Now.